thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. My name is Mike Shade. I am the Mind the Store campaign director with Safer Chemicals Healthy Families. We're one of the sponsors of today's webinar, along with Toxic-Free Future. We're here today to talk about our newly released report that came out just a couple months ago, Packaged in Pollution, Our Food Chains Using PFAS in Packaging. This is our new investigation into PFAS, the forever chemicals in food contact materials and food packaging at 6 major fast food chains and fast casual chains. As I mentioned, today's webinar is sponsored by Toxic-Free Future, Mind the Store campaign, and Safer Chemicals Healthy Families. Just to say a couple of words about each organization or program, Toxic-Free Future is a science and advocacy organization that's focused on changing markets and policies to reduce exposure to toxic chemicals. And here at Safer Chemicals Healthy Families and the Mind the Store campaign, together we fight for strong chemical policy, work with retailers to phase out hazardous chemicals, and educate the public about ways to protect our families from toxic chemicals. Next slide, please. So a little bit of housekeeping. So everyone is muted. We have had a lot of interest in today's webinar, so we'll have to keep everyone on mute just for sound quality purposes. But don't worry, there will be plenty of opportunity to ask questions during the session. If you have any questions, if you look at the Zoom icons that should be either at the bottom or top of your screen, if you look at the Q&A icon, you'll be able to ask questions there. So feel free to type in any questions as we go through the webinar. We're going to launch a poll now. What we'd like to do is just take a moment to invite folks to let us know what you would like to get out of today's webinar. So if you, over the next couple minutes, could take a look at that, that'll just be helpful for us to get a sense of what folks are most interested in. Some other housekeeping items to mention. We often get asked on webinars like this whether slides will be made available or whether the recording will be made available. I'm happy to share that we'll be sharing both. So we should be sending out a link to the slides, a copy of the recording, I believe on YouTube tomorrow. So look out for that email, which will be sent likely tomorrow afternoon. So again, my name is Mike Shade. I coordinate the Mind the Store campaign. I'm one of the speakers on today's webinar. I'll be moderating. And joining me is Jen Dickman with the Mind the Store campaign and Safer Chemicals Healthy Families, and Erica Schrader with Toxic-Free Future. Both Jen and Erica are the co-authors of the recent report. So just to say a couple of words and introduce Jen and Erica. Jen is a senior program associate for Safer Chemicals Healthy Families and the Mind the Store campaign. She serves as the lead analyst on our annual retailer report card. She holds a law degree with a concentration in environmental law from the University of Maryland School of Law and a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from the University of Delaware. Our other third speaker is Erica Schrader. Erica has worked on the Toxic-Free Future staff since 1997, and she leads its research program, serving as science director. She obtained her master's from the School of Natural Resources and Environment at the University of Michigan and has a bachelor's BS in molecular biology from MIT. And we're really glad to have both of them with us today. Again, if you haven't answered the poll yet, please take a moment to take a look at the poll, and we'll be closing that in just a moment. Next slide. So just to ground us in terms of what we'll be discussing today, so we'll kick the webinar off talking about why we're concerned about PFAS chemicals in food packaging and the environment. We'll do a quick review of some of the health hazards of these extremely persistent forever chemicals, talk about how they can migrate into food and get into the larger environment. We'll then give a pretty quick overview of the methodology for the investigation, sharing information about the testing that was conducted recently. And then from there, we will spend some time sharing, going over the results and key findings from the investigation. From there, we will review and discuss solutions. We'll talk about some recent corporate policies that have been adopted by top grocery and fast food chains. We'll also give a quick summary of some recent policies enacted in states around the country on PFAS and food contact materials. And then from there, we'll begin discussing recommendations for government agencies, and we'll review brand new guidance documents that we put out recently, offering detailed recommendations on what are the key steps that retailers can take to go about addressing PFAS in food contact materials. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll have a little bit of time, hopefully 10 or 15 minutes, to do some Q&A. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in to the Q&A icon at the bottom. Jen, can you end the poll, and we'll take a moment to review the results real quick. Great. Well, it looks like the number one highest voting response was with 61% of respondents wanted to learn about the test results from the recent report. So we'll spend some time talking about that for sure. The next response that came in was discover what types of food packaging may contain PFAS. Well, thanks everyone, and we'll definitely be talking about everything that you see here. So thanks so much for participating in the poll. You can stop sharing the poll, Jen. Great. So with that, I am going to pass the mic to Jen, who's going to give some background on why we're concerned about PFAS and talk about the methodology on the report.
Great, thank you, Mike. So why did we investigate PFAS? So first, to step back a bit, PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. This is a very large class, it includes thousands of chemicals, and chemicals in this class have been found to be highly persistent, mobile, and toxic. Studies have shown evidence of broad exposure. Drinking water sources for millions of Americans have been found to be contaminated by PFAS, and CDC analyzed blood levels of PFAS, and they estimated the results to indicate widespread exposure to certain PFAS. One of the biggest uses of PFAS is food packaging, and the images shown below are examples of the types of food packaging that have been found to be likely PFAS treated in previous studies, a bakery bag and a popcorn bag. Chemicals in this class have been linked to many severe health effects, cancer, thyroid disease, decreased fertility, and the list goes on and on, immune system suppression, which is especially scary with the current pandemic. The New York Times article that's shown to the right talks in detail about some of these health impacts, and also in the context of pregnant women. So our study, Packaged in Pollution, builds on previous studies, including this 2017 study that was conducted by the Silent Spring Institute, Green Science Policy Institute, Environmental Working Group, and others. And they looked at over 300 name brand fast food packaging items, including wrappers, fry boxes, and bakery papers. And they found that 40% tested positive for fluorinated chemicals. And of those, 56% of the bakery wrappers and bags tested were positive fluorinated chemicals, and also 38% of sandwich wrappers and burger wrappers were positive. So our current study also follows one of our previous studies, which was in 2018. The study was titled Takeout Toxics, and it investigated PFAS in food packaging at top grocery chains. We worked with state partners across the country to collect items from a variety of grocery stores, and we collected from the states that are pictured in the map shown here in green. So the study focused on the following grocery stores: Ahold Delhaize, Albertsons, Kroger, and subsidiaries, and also Trader Joe's and Whole Foods. It looked at packaging in the categories that are shown in the left-hand column: takeout containers, bakery or deli papers, single-use plates, trays for cook-at-home food, and baking or cooking supplies. And the chart here shows the number of items that were tested as likely PFAS treated based on total fluorine screening conducted by Dr. Peasley at the University of Notre Dame. out of the total number that we sent for testing. So if you look at the top row, the takeout containers had the highest number of likely PFAS treated items. Most of these, if you look at the bottom, are molded fiber. And then for the bakery or deli paper category, which had the second highest number of likely treated PFAS items, items that were likely PFAS treated, that we found to be likely PFAS treated, included cake plates, a bakery bag, and a sandwich wrapper. Overall, 10 of 78 items were likely PFAS treated, which shows that in many cases, retailers provide packaging that is free of PFAS treatment, indicating that PFAS-free alternatives are available. So PFAS containing food packaging is used once, but the chemicals can last forever in the environment. They pollute for generations to come, and there are multiple ways that people can be exposed. If you look to the right, when PFAS containing food packaging, when the PFAS in PFAS containing food packaging migrates out of the food packaging into food, and people eat the food, they're exposed. If you look to the left, which talks about the disposal, when PFAS containing food packaging is disposed of in landfills, for example, the PFAS can migrate out in landfill leachate or landfill gas and pollute the air or water that we breathe and drink. When this packaging is composted, because many of the PFAS containing food packaging items can be compostable like molded fiber, PFAS can also contaminate the compost. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. And so in both of these cases, when PFAS gets into the environment or into crops, it circles back around to food. Circles back around to people, excuse me. So people can be exposed in a few different ways. So more on the migration into food. PFAS have been found to move into food at room temperature. The migration increases with heating, and also it depends on the time that is in contact with food. The newer generation PFAS have been found to migrate into food more than the older chemicals. And butter wrapped in a coated wrapper was actually found to have an 8-fold increase in concentrations of one newer PFAS during storage. For the municipal compost side, so Zero Waste Washington and academics did a study that was released in 2019. They looked at 10 samples of compost from around the country. This was from 9 commercial facilities, of which 7 allowed food packaging and 1 from a backyard composting. And they found that there were much higher levels of PFAS in the compost that included food packaging, which shows that PFAS can contaminate compost when that PFAS containing food packaging is composted. So moving to the methodology for packaged and pollution, this study, we focused on the top 3 burger chains, Burger King, McDonald's, and Wendy's, and 3 top health conscious chains, Cava, Freshii, and Sweetgreen. We chose paper food packaging based on a few characteristics. The first was whether it was used to hold popular foods, like the Big Mac from McDonald's, whether it was used to hold greasy foods like fries or cookies, and whether it was previously found to contain PFAS in the studies that I just talked about, for example. We collected from locations that were in and around DC, New York, and Seattle, and this was a much smaller collection than our previous study. We unfortunately couldn't collect in more than those locations because of time constraints, but we still wanted to be able to look at whether there was some regional variability. So we collected in 3 locations, the 3 regions of the country. So overall, we collected 29 unique samples in the categories that are shown. Burgers and sandwiches, for that category, we collected wrappers and a thin cardboard box for the Big Mac. We collected fried items or desserts that were in paperboard, or that had paperboard containers and bags. We collected the paperboard containers and bag packaging for those. And then we also collected molded fiber for salads and warm bowls. And the images that are shown here were actually taken just after the collection, so that's why they're in plastic bags, so there's a little bit of glare. So we followed specific procedures for both the collection and the processing to make sure that There was no contamination. And after processing, we sent them to an independent laboratory, Galbraith Laboratories, to be screened for total fluorine content as an indicator of PFAS treatment. And Galbraith uses combustion with ion selective electrode to screen for total fluorine content. We use total fluorine content because it's the best way to screen for PFAS. It is impractical to test for individual PFAS because there are thousands of chemicals in the class and labs can't test for most of them. We use a threshold of 100 parts per million to determine whether there was suggested PFAS treatment. And we chose 100 parts per million to harmonize with the thresholds used by compostability certifiers. Values under 100 parts per million, but still above the detection limit, may also indicate the presence of lower levels of PFAS, possibly from contamination or recycled content. And now I'll pass it on to Erica to talk about the results.
Jen, and thanks also to everybody for being here today to learn more about this really important topic. So I'm going to start in talking about the results by giving some more details on what we tested. So for each of the chains, our goal was to get a sense of what was happening with the most important packaging that they're using. And so for the burger chains, that's really all about the burger wrappers. And as Jen mentioned, we wanted to get a little bit of sense of whether there was regional variation or not. So for each of the burger chains, we selected one burger wrapper that we would collect from 3 different locations around the country. And then we also collected wrappers that were also used for other important items. So for Burger King, we collected 3 different wrappers from different locations for the Whopper, as well as wrappers for the Whopper Junior and the one that's used for the hamburger or the cheeseburger. For McDonald's, that was 3 different locations. There were wrappers for the double cheeseburger, as well as wrappers for the Egg McMuffin and the McChicken. For Wendy's, it was 3 wrappers for their small hamburger. And then 2 of the health conscious chains also offer sandwiches. So we collected wrappers from Cava as well as Freshie. So for the fries, fried foods, fries and other fried foods and other sides, including desserts that are offered at these chains, there are 2 different kinds of packaging. So we collected both the small paper bags like you see pictured here, as well as paperboard. So this slide goes over what we collected in terms of the bags. So for Burger King, that was bags used for chicken nuggets. And there's one that they use for either French toast or the cookies. For McDonald's, they use bags for their small fries and their cookies, and we collected those. Wendy's, we collected the cookie bag, and then Cava serves pita chips in a small bag. And then for the same kinds of food items, these chains, the burger chains, also use paperboard, which you can also see pictured here, some examples. So for Burger King, they used paperboard for their tater tots, chicken fries, and French fries. That McDonald's uses the paperboard for chicken McNuggets, kids fries, and medium fries. And then for the Big Mac, it's not really a paperboard container, it's more of a cardboard. So it's a heavier item that's kind of in a class of its own. And then Wendy's uses paperboard for their, they have 2 different containers we collected one for junior fries and nuggets and one for medium fries and nuggets. For the health conscious chains, the really important packaging they have are these molded fiber bowls that is pretty much what they use to serve all of their meals. So because of that, we collected those from 2 different locations. These chains don't have as many locations as the burger chains. So for each of them, we collected molded fiber bowls from 2 different locations, and then whatever else they were, whatever other kind of molded fiber packaging they had. So for Cava, we also included the tray they used for the kids' meal. And then Sweetgreen differentiates between bowls that they use for warm food and for salad. So we collected the salad bowl as well. This slide shows the results, and there's a lot going on here, so I'm going to walk you through. So if you look at the top, the part that's highlighted in orange, the first column shows the results for the wrappers. So if you look down, the dots that are colored in red show the the packaging items that tested positive for fluorine above the screening level of 100 parts per million. So for the burger wrappers, or the burger and sandwich wrappers, we collected a total of 9, and just 2 of those tested positive for fluorine. The cardboard container, you see there's just 1, that's the next column over. That was that Big Mac container from McDonald's, and it did test positive for fluorine above 100 parts per million. Moving over to the right, there are columns for the packaging used for fries, other fried items, and desserts. If you look down at the results for the paper bags, we collected a total of 6 paper bags, and all 6 of them tested positive. Next column over, for the paperboard containers, we collected 8, and none of them tested positive. So we see a really big difference in that kind of packaging. And then moving farther over to the right, we have the results for the molded fiber bowls and trays. We collected a total of 5 of those, and all 5 tested positive for fluorine above the screening level. And then if you look at it by retailer, for Burger King, we tested a total of 8, and 3 of those were positive. McDonald's was similar, it was 3 out of 9. And then Wendy's didn't have as much variety in their packaging, so we just tested fewer, but it was 1 out of 4 tested positive. And I'll just note, as you're looking at those, we included the numbers of stores that each of these have. So, these represent, even though it wasn't, it may look like a small number of different packaging types, it represents a lot of packaging because these are very large companies that have many, many locations. And so one type of packaging that tests positive for PFAS, or, positive for fluorine at a level suggesting PFAS treatment, means that there may be a lot of packaging out there being used that contains PFAS. The health conscious chains, all 4 of the items from Kava were positive. For Freshie, it was 1 of 2, and for Sweetgreen, it was 2 of 2. And I'll note that for these chains, because they were so dependent on molded fiber, until recently, they really didn't have any other options if they wanted to stick with molded fiber, because all of the molded fiber in the market, as far as we know, did contain PFAS. And that has changed recently, giving them some opportunity to move away from PFAS. So to summarize the results, we found we found levels of fluorine suggesting PFAS treatment in 14 of the 29 products. So nearly half, and that includes some of the key products that we tested. So some iconic items like the Burger King Whopper, that was the 1 burger wrapper that tested positive for fluorine, and then the container used for the Big Mac as well. And then of course the molded fiber bowls that are really the workhorse of the salad chain packaging. And the other thing I wanted to point out on that chart was, if you look at the packaging used for the fries and fried items and desserts, you see a really big difference between the results for the paper bags and for the paperboard. Even though they're used for the same types of items, all of the paper bags that we tested were positive for fluorine, and none of the paperboard containers was positive for fluorine. So that gives us a sense that companies may be able to move away from PFAS in this case for those types of items by choosing a different kind of material. Okay, now you can go on to the next slide, Jen. And I have a couple slides illustrating the items that we found that tested positive for fluorine above 100 parts per million, just to give you a better sense and give you some better photos. So for the burger chains, it was those 2 really important items, the Big Mac and the Whopper. And again, that was the only burger wrapper that we found that was positive. And then the paper bags containing either desserts or fried items. And then for the health conscious chains, it was all of the molded fiber that we tested. And then there is a small bag used for pita chips. I think that was Kava. And then one of the chains has a sandwich that tested positive. So to wrap it up on a positive note, we definitely, as I said, nearly half of the samples that we tested altogether were positive for fluorine. But if we look at the burger chains, about 2/3 of the items that we tested were PFAS-free. And particularly in the wrappers, they were almost entirely PFAS-free. So that definitely shows that there may have been some improvement here and that change is possible and that these companies can make better choices and start serving packaging that is free of PFAS.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Jen and Erica. That was really informative. So we're now going to transition a little bit now that we've discussed what we did and what we found. We're going to start talking about solutions. Before I dive into that, just as a reminder, if folks have any questions, if you can please type it into the Q&A as opposed to the chat, that would just be helpful so we can track the questions so that we can make sure we get to them during the Q&A. So, why should retailers act? Why should retailers care about this issue? We think that there's a really strong business case for retailers and brands to take action on PFAS chemicals in food packaging and other food contact materials. Addressing this issue can really enhance companies' brand reputation and also help to build trust with key stakeholders, especially consumers, as well as investors. Consumers today want to know that the food that they're buying at the store is safe and healthy. And they don't want to buy food that may come in packaging that could be contaminated with hazardous chemicals like PFAS. So taking action on PFAS can actually help build that trust with consumers, which is so important for so many companies. Addressing this issue can also help enhance your reputation with other stakeholders, like investors who are increasingly wanting to understand how companies are managing chemicals of high concern, like PFAS, in their supply chain. An example of that is this past year, investors filed a shareholder resolution at TJX, asking the company to develop a chemicals policy and reduce their chemical footprint. And amazingly, nearly 50%, I think it was 47 or 48% of investors supported this resolution. And I think that's evident of the concern that exists in the financial community about how companies are managing this issue, because investors clearly see the reputational liabilities, the financial risks, the legal risks that are maybe associated with issues like PFAS in food packaging and other toxics. Additionally, for companies that are proactively managing chemicals and addressing issues like PFAS in food packaging, it can help companies meet and implement the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, and also help companies meet the SASB standards that exist for retail. Additionally, on the flip side, proactively managing chemicals of concern like PFAS in packaging can also help companies mitigate regulatory liabilities and get out in front of potential financial and legal risks. Increasingly, we're seeing cities and states and governments all around the world, in Europe and elsewhere, introducing and enacting legislation restricting chemicals like PFAS. So proactively managing this in your supply chain can help companies get out in front of these regulatory liabilities and help mitigate and avoid possibly costly financial and legal risks. And of course, it's the right thing to do. There's a growing scientific consensus that exposure to chemicals like the class of PFAS have been linked to serious health problems that are on the rise in our society. And as Jen noted, at a time of COVID, scientists are sounding the alarm that exposure to PFAS chemicals can actually make us more vulnerable to infectious diseases like COVID. So retailers and brands have a real opportunity to leverage their market power and influence to drive these chemicals out of food contact materials, which will also help prevent pollution where these chemicals are manufactured, and also when these chemicals are eventually disposed of, and help drive the development of safer alternatives and green chemistry solutions. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, consumers care about these issues. Since we published our report, we've launched a campaign and a petition calling on McDonald's, as the largest fast food chain, not only in the US, but worldwide, to take action on this. Just a couple weeks ago, we launched this petition on change.org calling on McDonald's to stop using PFAS chemicals especially given how these chemicals can contaminate communities where the chemicals are manufactured, such as this one that you see pictured here. This is a community down in Alabama. There's a company by the name of Daikin, who is one of the key manufacturers of PFAS chemicals for food packaging. And unfortunately, this community downstream of this and other chemical plants, their drinking water has become contaminated with PFAS chemicals. So if companies like McDonald's take action on PFAS, this can help drive these chemicals out of the marketplace, helping to safeguard frontline communities that have been affected. And just as evidence of the level of concern, nearly 70,000 people have signed this petition alone over the last week or two. So that's just evident of the concern that exists out there among consumers. Next slide, please. So the good news is cities, states, government agencies around the world are acting. They're enacting bans on these chemicals in food packaging. Just in the last couple of years, the states of Maine and Washington have passed legislation banning PFAS chemicals in food packaging. Similar legislation has been introduced in states all across the country. And most recently, here in New York State, where I live, the State Assembly and Senate has also passed very similar legislation, and that legislation is now sitting on Governor Andrew Cuomo's desk, and we're hopeful that he will sign it. So companies that use PFAS chemicals or that may have these chemicals in their food packaging soon will be forced to get these chemicals out due to these laws. So now is really the time for companies to develop proactive management plans to phase them out, to comply with these laws that are coming down the pipeline. Next slide. The good news is that in response to our engagement and advocacy over the last couple of years, we've seen a number of businesses step up. A number of grocery chains have begun to take action on PFAS. Last year, Ahold Delhaize, which is the largest grocery chain here on the East Coast, they announced a new chemical policy commitment that has goals to phase PFAS and other chemicals of concern, to phase them out of their packaging as well as other products. Albertsons, another chain whose products that we've tested before, they've begun to reformulate some of their items. For example, they have eliminated PFAS in the cake plates in their stores, which have been found to contain high levels of fluorine, suggesting PFAS treatment. Trader Joe's has said that they've instructed their vendors to no longer use PFAS chemicals in food packaging. And of course, Whole Foods Market, in response to the report we published nearly 2 years ago, Whole Foods announced that they were reformulating the items that we were testing, removing PFAS from those items in their stores. And they were actually the first major grocery chain in the US to act. First major national grocery chain to act, I should say. In the fast food sector, in the fast casual sector, we've also seen some significant movement over the last year or two. Last year in our annual retailer report card, Panera Bread announced that it had begun to reformulate items that may contain PFAS. For example, they said as of this June, their baguette bags would no longer contain PFAS, which is exciting. Earlier this year in January, just a couple of months after Taco Bell received a poor grade in our retail report card, they announced a new set of commitments to phase PFAS and other chemicals of concern out of food packaging by 2025. I should note, though, that timeline is a timeline that we are concerned about, given the health risks and given the extreme persistence of these chemicals. We're encouraging companies to set more aggressive timelines. A couple of months ago, earlier this year, after we conducted the testing, we reached out to the six burger chains and the six burger chains and the healthier food chains to let them know that this report was coming out, and to brief them on our findings, and to give them an opportunity to respond in advance of our report. And I'm pleased to share that in March, to their credit, Sweetgreen announced that it had begun to reformulate its food packaging already to comply with the City of San Francisco law, and that it was planning to phase PFAS out of its molded fiber containers by the end of 2020. A couple of weeks later, Chipotle made a very similar policy commitment. Chipotle also announced that it would phase PFAS out of its molded fiber containers by the end of 2020. And then on the day of our report release in August, both Kava and Freshie both announced that they would reformulate their food packaging items that we had tested. They were going to remove PFAS from the molded fiber containers by mid-2021. So in response to our report, 3 out of the 6 chains that we have sampled have announced strong policy commitments to phase out PFAS, and we give them a lot of credit and kudos for doing the right thing. Unfortunately, to date, so far, McDonald's, Burger King, and Wendy's have yet to make the same commitments, and we're really hoping that they will act quickly to address this critical food safety and sustainability issue. Next slide, please. So, what do we like to see? So clearly there's a need for government action. So we're calling on city and state governments to introduce, Jen, if you can advance the slides, please, to introduce and enact legislation to ban PFAS chemicals in food packaging and to transition to safer alternatives. We expect many other cities and states to introduce legislation in the year ahead. At the same time, government agencies have a lot of market power themselves. Governments buy things for food cafeterias when, cafeterias hopefully will one day reopen. So we're also encouraging government agencies at the local level and at the state level and at the federal level to leverage their institutional purchasing power to buy safer PFAS-free food serviceware for their government buildings. We're also calling on Congress to act. Representative Dingell has introduced legislation called the Keep Food Containers Safe from PFAS Act. This is national legislation that would phase out and ban PFAS at the federal level, and this is something that we're urging members of Congress to support, and something that we hope will move in the year or the years ahead. We're also calling on the FDA to withdraw its approvals for all PFAS as a class in food contact materials, to not approve any new PFAS. Recently, just a couple months ago, actually, I think right before our report came out, or right around the time that it came out, the FDA announced that it was withdrawing its approval for a handful of PFAS chemicals. While that was a small baby step in the right direction, it's not enough. We really think FDA needs to withdraw approval for the entire class. There's no reason why these chemicals should continue to be allowed in food packaging, given both their toxicity and also especially given their severe persistence in the environment. We're also encouraging at the local level and the regional level, commercial composting facilities also must act. Given the fact that these chemicals can migrate out of the food packaging and contaminate compost and then get into the food supply, as a result, we're encouraging commercial composting facilities to only accept food packaging that is certified as PFAS-free. And thankfully, there's some pretty strong third-party standards adopted by the Biodegradable Products Institute and the Compost Manufacturing Alliance that can help composting facilities move in that direction. Next slide, please. So, we've been getting a lot of questions from companies over the last couple of years. Well, how do you go about adopting and implementing a policy? What are the steps that you recommend? So we've put together 2 new set of policy recommendations, which are available for free on our website. If you go to mindthestore.org, you can download these 2 guides that walk companies through the steps that we recommend that they consider taking to go about adopting and implementing a policy to phase out PFAS. So I'm going to walk through those relatively quick, and then we'll transition to Q&A. So for one, we're calling on brands and retailers to adopt public-facing policies to phase out and ban PFAS in food packaging and food contact materials. It's really critical for companies as part of that to include quantifiable goals with clear and aggressive timelines to phase out these chemicals. The timelines that Sweetgreen and Chipotle announced this March are evident of the type of timelines that we'd like to see. Both companies announced that they would phase out these chemicals by the end of this year. So that's the type of timeline we really encourage companies to consider. It's also critical for companies to clearly communicate their policies, and to train suppliers about how they can comply with them. Next slide, please. So, where do you begin? It's a complicated issue. It's challenging. It's hard to know where these chemicals may be found. So we recommend a phased approach, starting with materials for food served in store. Time and time again, we've been seeing these chemicals showing up in to-go containers, showing up in compostable molded fiber containers. So we think that that is a really important place to begin, starting with materials for food served in stores. Also looking at things like sandwich wraps and cookie wraps that you may have in your delis. Secondly, prioritizing greasier foods that food packaging for greasier foods for private label or own brand food. Clearly, retailers have the most power over their own brands, and we think that's also a really important place to lean into. But we don't think companies should stop there. We are also concerned that some brand name food, such as microwavable popcorn, is likely treated with PFAS. There have been a number of studies that have identified PFAS in the packaging for microwavable popcorn. So we also think companies also need to take a hard look at brand name packaging and really leaning into the types of packaging that we and others have found to likely contain PFAS. And we think that our testing and the testing that others have done can really help provide companies a roadmap of where to prioritize. Next slide, please. The second step is really about disclosure in testing. Companies should require suppliers to provide written statements attesting that their materials are PFAS-free, but also we are recommending companies require their suppliers to conduct their own testing and to provide those test results to the retailers. And as Jen noted, given that there are literally thousands of PFAS chemicals that are out there that may possibly be in food contact materials, we recommend companies use a total fluorine testing methodology to screen for the likely presence of PFAS. And we recommend that companies require this testing on a minimum at an annual basis to ensure that as companies change suppliers or change materials over time, that any new packaging doesn't contain PFAS. Next slide. We also think it's important for companies, retailers, to do their own testing to ensure that the information that they're hearing from suppliers is accurate. And again, we're not saying that companies should test every single, say, a grocery store, every single food packaging item. That may not be feasible or viable, but really to lean into and focus on the materials that are most likely to contain PFAS, such as those that we've found in our reports and those in other studies. If elevated levels of fluorine are found, we recommend retailers work with their suppliers to develop action plans to phase it out. In cases where the levels are relatively low, below 100 parts per million, we still think that companies should look into that to understand what's going on. Where is that fluorine coming from? Is it because of contamination from, say, contaminated water that may be in the slurry? Is it coming from other materials like mold release agents? We know that PFAS may be used as mold release agents for certain plastics. There was a study that information that CEH put out that identified PFAS in some PLA plastic packaging. So that's one area that we think also requires some focus and more investigation. Next slide. And then it's critical to ensure substitutes are safe. We're never going to solve these problems if we go from one bad actor toxic chemical to another. So we strongly recommend that companies screen alternatives for safety. Generally, we strongly encourage companies to move towards reusables to address the solid waste crisis that we're facing in this country and on this planet, especially at a time when there's conversations happening about zero waste and a circular economy. We really need to be moving towards reusable systems. And whether it's a reusable or a single-use material, either way, companies should conduct alternatives assessments and hazard assessments to ensure that alternative ingredients are actually safe and we're not, trading PFAS for another chemical that's, say, maybe a carcinogen or hormone disruptor. So there are tools that are out there like the green screen that can help companies assess the safety of alternatives. And I should mention that the green screen will be coming out with a new standard for food packaging very soon in the next couple months, which will be, I think, helpful for brand owners and retailers. So look out for that. Next slide, please. And then the final recommendations, write all these requirements into contracts and specs with suppliers. There really needs to be clear written requirements in specs and contracts. And finally, transparency is critical. We recommend that companies adopt public-facing policies and report on an annual basis, both progress that they're making and also any challenges that they may be facing. Many companies today publish CSR, sustainability reports. Those are great venues for sharing information about progress in transitioning away from PFAS. And it's also critical to be transparent about what materials or ingredients you're substituting PFAS for. It's not enough to just say, hey, this is PFAS-free, but not actually be transparent about what the alternatives are. We think that consumers have a fundamental right to know about the alternative materials or ingredients that are being used. Next slide, and this is the final slide. I just wanted to note that we are solutions oriented, and in addition to highlighting the problems, we also like to share information about solutions. So in addition to these new guidance documents that we've published that I was just walking through, we just published a brand new fact sheet, which is available on our website, which has information about alternatives to PFAS, companies that offer PFAS-free packaging options in a variety of product categories where these chemicals are commonly found. So if you go to our website, mindthestore.org, if you look at that recent blog we put out about the new guidance documents, if you scroll down to the bottom under downloads, you'll find a link to that. Next slide. So that concludes our presentation. Thank you so much. And in our remaining 10 minutes or so, we'll now open it up to questions and answers. Again, if you have any questions, you can type it in the Q&A box. I see we have a lot of questions, so we're probably not going to get to all of them, but we will do our best over here. So, and I should also mention as we're reviewing the questions, we have here our contact information. So if you want to get in touch with us, you can email me and I can connect you to our team. And I also have here the websites for our programs and also our social media handles, so you can connect with us there. So Jen and Erica, if you guys can take yourselves off mute, that would be very much helpful. So I'm gonna just try to go through some of the questions here. We're probably not gonna get to all of them. So one question here, and maybe Erica can take this, is does PFAS in compost then migrate into our food/plants? Have plants shown an ability to uptake PFAS into the plant itself via soil?
Thanks, Mike. So I don't know of any studies that have looked specifically at PFAS contaminated compost and then looked at the levels in plants, but there is a study that looked at PFAS contaminated biosolids, so something relatively similar, and did find that the PFAS moved from the soil into the plants. So, one thing about PFAS that makes them such troublesome chemicals is that they're mobile in the environment. And so they can become soluble in the soil and then move up into the plant.
Great, thanks, Erica. Another sort of general question is, can you explain a little more? I think they said what PFAS, but I think they were asking why, like why is it typically used in food packaging?
Jen, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so I had forgotten to say that. So it's used to impart grease or water resistance, typically.
Right, so that's why, we're seeing it in the packaging for things like French fries and the Big Mac and the Whopper, materials, food items that are a little bit greasier. So yeah, so that's typically why it's historically been used. Another question, and maybe this one I could ask Erica, is there research determining how much PFAS passes through humans from the food that they consume? In other words, does it actually end up in wastewater treatment plant discharges and biosolids?
So PFAS do end up in wastewater treatment plant effluent as well as sludge. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's because it's passing through humans. We also have a lot of PFAS in our home environments, in the air, and in the dust. And so another way that the PFAS may be moving from our homes to wastewater treatment plants is actually via our clothing. When we wash it in the laundry, that's been found for flame retardants to be a major pathway. So some of it may be because it's, you know, being eliminated by humans, but probably a lot of it is that it's getting into our it's going into our laundry water. We also have textiles, of course, that are laundered that contain PFAS. So that's another way that it could be going directly from products to the wastewater treatment plant, because PFAS, I think this, I'll just go ahead and answer another question that I spotted while I'm on it. PFAS are used in food packaging, but also very widely used as stain protection treatments on other items found in the home. So that would be things like upholstery, carpet, and apparel, mostly outdoor wear, but some other types of apparel as well.
Another question is about kind of the geographic distribution, and this is one reason why we collected samples in multiple regions. As Jen mentioned, we collected samples here in the New York City area, Washington, DC, Seattle, Washington area. The question is it possible that the large chains all get their packaging from the same manufacturer, and therefore they have similar composition? And I think it's also about, you know, is there chances that there may be differences regionally?
I can take that. So, you know, we don't know where the chains are getting their packaging from. So, and, you know, we did, you know, some sampling to look for regional variation, because we thought that was quite possible that they would have different suppliers on the West Coast and the East Coast, for example. For the types of packaging that we looked at from multiple regions, we didn't see any variation. That doesn't mean that there isn't any in other types of packaging.
Another question is, how are you defining the newer generation of PFAS?
So basically, you know, some of the PFAS have been phased out by major manufacturers. That doesn't mean that there aren't manufacturers in the US or elsewhere that are still using them. But for the food contact, what's allowed now are a certain set that have been called short chain as opposed to long chain. So, and then FDA did announce in either late July or August also that some of those approvals are also going to be eliminated over the next few years. So the universe is narrowing even more of what PFAS will be allowed to be used in food packaging.
Great. Another question is, how has molded fiber treatment changed away from PFAS recently? What alternatives are being offered or tested, and by whom?
So as far as I know, and Jen, you can add to this, I believe that all of the treatments for molded fiber are proprietary, and the companies have not disclosed what they're using to replace the PFAS for the grease and water resistance. Jen, do you have anything to add on that?
So going back to the alternative slide, the chart that was created does indicate that there are some molded fiber with bioplastic linings, but so those there might be more specificity around those, but I think for the most part, we don't know what they're using as a drop-in additive.
Yeah, and I would just add that, you know, in the case of Sweetgreen, and I think Chipotle as well, both companies we know are working with the company Footprint on an alternative. So they've worked with Footprint to transition their molded fiber containers to a new similar type of molded fiber container that does not contain PFAS. Unfortunately, Footprint has said that the alternative chemistry is a bio-based chemical. However, the company has not been fully transparent in disclosing its chemistry, and that's something that we hope they and other companies will consider over time, because as I was mentioning, we think it's really critical for companies to be transparent about alternative materials and also alternative chemistries. Again, we don't think it's enough for anyone to say that something is just PFAS-free and we should assume that it's fine. It's really critical for companies to be transparent about alternative ingredients so that consumers and other stakeholders can be rest assured that the alternatives are actually safe. The next question is about, and thanks everyone for the questions, lots of great stuff here. We're doing our best to get through as many as we can. Another question is, what would be the ideal state policy on PFAS in food packaging look like beyond just the ban? I'm wondering what best practices might be for additional language to prevent loopholes and ensure that the law stays relevant over time. I don't know, Erica, if you want to take that one.
Well, I think the most important thing in looking at state policy is to make sure it's addressing PFAS as a class. So, our law in Washington banned the use of all PFAS in food packaging and set a phase out timeline. So that's really the key point. This is, in looking at PFAS in general, we feel strongly that we need to end all non-essential uses of PFAS, and food packaging definitely falls into that category because there are alternatives to PFAS.
And I would just mention that a really great resource for thinking about, what could a model local or state policy look like is the Safer States website. The Safer States website has information about model policies that have been introduced and enacted around the country, and you can find information there about the bills that have been passed, for example, in the states of Washington and in the state of Maine. Another resource is the Toxics in Packaging Clearinghouse is working on updating the model toxics and packaging laws that exist around the country, and I know that they're considering recommendations to expand the model toxics and packaging bill that many states have adopted to address other chemicals of high concern in packaging. So that's another resource to look at. Another question that has come up is, do you have any reference literature information from manufacturers for 100 parts per million threshold for screening, above 100 intentionally treated with PFAS, below unintentionally? I think in part maybe what the person is asking about is, why are we using the 100 parts per million number for the screening in the investigation?
Yeah, and I think there were a number of questions about the levels in general. So as Jen said, we chose 100 parts per million to harmonize with what the compostability certifiers are using. So they're using that as a cutoff. So that, but they, in addition to that number, what the certifiers require is disclosure of ingredients and assurance that there's no PFAS included. So, what we don't consider it, a hard and fast. If it's below 100, it's okay. It doesn't have PFAS. If it's above 100, it's not. It definitely has PFAS. We used it as a screening level, and for companies that are purchasing food packaging, if you're doing that screening and finding that you get a number where it's detectable, but below 100, it's still cause for looking into it further and seeing if there's some source of PFAS in the packaging.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I wish we could have gotten to these other questions, but if you have follow-up questions, Jen, if you can go to the last slide, please. I encourage you to get in touch and reach out to us. There's my email there. You can also get in touch with us via social media. Highly recommend folks take a look at the report. Again, it's available on our websites. The report again is Packaged in Pollution. We also strongly encourage folks to take a look at the new guidance documents that we've published for quick service restaurant chains and also for grocery chains. We think that's a really useful resource. And finally, also the new fact sheet we just put out on alternatives. We'll soon also be publishing a more extensive spreadsheet with information about other brands that offer PFAS-free packaging. So stay tuned for that. We should be putting that out over the next couple of months. Thanks again for joining us. Sorry we weren't able to get all the questions given the limited time. And as I mentioned, we will be sending out a link to the recording as well as a link to today's slides, and we'll close it from there. So thanks everyone. Have a great afternoon, and thanks again. Stay tuned for future presentations.